My grandmother read her horoscope and talked to the conjure woman to make the right tea to solve a problem. Some of my friends find peace in yoga and Buddhist meditation. Other Black folk gather crystals, turn tarot cards, and set up ancestral altars, and go to church every Sunday. Or maybe they don't, because churches condemn their practices, but they have no problem with Jesus.
Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
Welcome to Diverse Devotions, Black Belief Across Boundaries, where we wade into the waters of religious multiplicity, Black faith, and spiritual journeys. Discover what happens when Black spirituality breaks the rules of how being religious is supposed to work. I'm Monica A. Coleman, writer, university professor, ordained clergy person, and initiated Iyala Orisha. In Diverse Devotions, I'll lead you through a tapestry of captivating narratives and thought-provoking dialogues. We'll hear the spiritual journeys of Black folk who practice more than one religion. We'll also hear from individuals whose acceptance of different religions emanates from an understanding of laws of nature and universal spiritual principles. From the freedom of religious multiplicity to the personal journeys of transformation, each episode offers enlightening perspectives that expand the boundaries of Black belief. So, if you're a seeker hungry for knowledge, religiously devout, an educator curious to understand, or simply intrigued by spirituality's rich diversity, follow and like Diverse Devotions. Be a part of this journey, because at the heart of these stories, you'll find the spirit of freedom. I am glad to welcome onto the podcast today Dr. Salim Faraji. Salim Faraji is professor and chair of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He is also the founding executive director of the Masters of Arts and International Studies Africa program at Concordia University Irvine in Ghana, West Africa. As a theological pluralist and interfaith practitioner, he is currently an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and a practicing African traditional priest, Okomfo, who has been initiated in both the Akan traditions of Ghana, West Africa, and ancient Egyptian religious practice. Dr. Faraji is author of The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh, and a contributor to the recent publications Life Under the Baobab Tree, Africana Studies and Religion in a Transitional Age, and New Perspectives on Ancient Nubia. More importantly, Salim is a longtime friend, about 25 years, and so I'm just glad to welcome you and excited for you to share some of your journey and your reflections on it with our listeners today. Welcome, Salim.
No, thank you so much. I, consider the opportunity to be here with you on your podcast and talk about this exciting and relevant topic. So I'm very pleased to be a guest today.
Now, I'm it's a little biased because you are a scholar and a practitioner, and I really want to ask you about your experiences as a practitioner. Now, you gave us a little kind of sense of this when you sent in your bio about what you call yourself, how you name yourself. And I want to come back to that, but tell us a bit about your spiritual journey. Where did you start? What were you raised in, if anything? And where are you now, and how did you get there?
Sure. Wow, where do I begin with my spiritual journey? I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm now living in Los Angeles. In fact, I've been here in Los Angeles for nearly 30 years. It'll be 30 years this summer that I've been here in Los Angeles. And I essentially came here in 1995 to attend graduate school. I went to Claremont School of Theology, where I did my Master of Divinity, and then I did my PhD work at Claremont Graduate University at the Claremont Colleges. So, but in terms of my spiritual journey, that begins in West Philadelphia. born and raised, so to speak, right?
Right.
The
What's a Gen X joke?
yeah,
Yes.
right. The the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right?
Right.
So I am West Philadelphia, born and raised, and so um, I was born and raised in a church, a community, in a family that were part of the Great Migration,
Mhm.
right? And we know the Great Migration in African American history, African culture. About 100 years ago, from the 1920s up until the 1970s, there are about 6 million African Americans, 6 million of us, left the Jim Crow segregation South, looking for greater opportunities and looking to get away from that restrictive, oppressive system. Some left voluntarily, some left involuntarily by force, violence, political terrorism, and so forth. And so both sides of my family, my mother and my father, come from Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, right? So the so-called low country, as well as Florida. And so they migrated to Philadelphia in, I think, the late 1940s.
Mhm.
I would be born 20 years after that, the late 1960s. And through my family, I grew up in a Black Baptist church where everyone in the church were migrants from the South,
Yeah.
everyone. And so what I saw was these Black Baptist traditions in Philadelphia from people who were from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. A few were even from the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth. And so that's where my spiritual journey began. I later in seminary began to, understand that tradition. I know Mikhail Sobal's classic work, the Afro-Baptist tradition, right? And so indeed, the hand clapping, the foot stomping, the awesome oratory through Black preaching and Black homiletics and so forth. I, experienced all of that growing up in my church. Was very active. I was on choirs. I was on usher boards, Boy Scouts, Vacation Bible School, right? Many things that we do. So I was groomed in this Afro-Baptist or African Baptist tradition and so forth. So this is where my journey began. And probably over the past 5 years, I've actually been revisiting that spiritual tradition through the lens of Zora Neale Hurston, right? Zora Neale Hurston wrote a lot on Black folk religion, Black folk culture, Black folk spirituality, what we call hoodoo, as well as voodoo, vodun, and so forth. And certainly that culture and spirituality shaped my family, right? Although my grandmother was a Baptist deaconess, right?
Mine too.
Yes, her medicinal practices, her culinary practices, her stories were rooted in African American folk spirituality and folk tradition, very much connected to what we call hoodoo. Although they didn't self-identify with that, but the practices, suggested that. And so I remember one time my grandmother, it was a fly flying around the house, right? And of course we wanted to get rid of the fly, either swat it or spray it or something. And my grandmother, who passed in 2010, she was 99 years old, right? She said, "Oh, you better leave that fly alone. You don't know if that's the spirit or the spirit of your grandfather." Right? And my grandfather had passed in 88. So she's like, that could be a transmigrated soul, right? That's basically what she was saying.
And of course, she didn't say transmigrated soul, right?
She didn't say transmigrated, but she said that could be the spirit of your grandfather. So I'm like, well, where did she get that worldview from? Where did she get that from? She didn't get that from Baptist polity. She got that, from the African American folk spirituality, which ultimately derived from the African continent. And so I was shaped in this tradition. And the older I get, I've come to appreciate it, very much, a great deal. Although as a teenager and as someone in my early 20s, I became critical of the tradition. You know, we often do that, right, in our youth, our adolescence, our early adulthood. And so I'm like,
Part of the process. Yeah.
all this preaching and singing, quote unquote, hooping and hollering, quote unquote, right? That's not how I understand it now. I wanted to know more. And so I lived in a community in West Philadelphia that was incredibly diverse, incredibly diverse. There were 5 maybe Islamic communities. There was a Sister Claire Muhammad school in my neighborhood. There was an African Orthodox Islamic mission. There were the Nubian Islamic Hebrews, who was another sect in the community. There was the NOI, who had Nation of Islam, who were in North and South Philly and so forth, right? And so in the 80s, you know, even into the 90s, you know, all of these religious traditions, you know, were in the community, and they were propagating, right? From selling incense and books to selling bean pies to passing out gospel pamphlets, right? Everyone had their own. And so I was, you know, I was surrounded by that. And so I attended some NOI services on Sunday after church, right? Because they would start around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And I also,
they knew that, right?
Yeah, they knew
you could
that,
go to
right.
church and then roll on over.
Exactly. And so, and then, you know, I also the other Islamic communities, and it got me very interested in the Quran. It got me very interested in the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. I became very, very interested and fascinated with the mystical tradition of Islam, Sufism. There was a mosque in West Philadelphia, in fact, in the neighborhood that Will Smith grew up in Winfield. There's a mosque there dedicated to Bawa Mahatmadin, who's a great Sri Lankan Sufi. And so, in fact, I even took the Shahada, right? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. It's the equivalent to, you know, accepting Jesus as your savior in the Christian tradition. And so I became immersed, you know, in Islam, studying the Quran, Sufism, and so forth. But even while I was doing that, I was curious about other traditions. So although I was taking my Islamic journey or escapade, so to speak, I had met some friends that were born and raised in the Yoruba tradition. In fact, in Philadelphia, there's a festival every June, New Year festival called Odunde.
Dunde.
And the founding family of Odunde were a part of the New York Yoruba temple that was founded in the 1960s, right? The first African American Yoruba temple. So my friend, he and I went to Penn State together, went to college together. He was born and raised in that tradition. He was born and raised, he's an African American who was born and raised in the Yoruba tradition. So I'm listening to that. I'm going to Bembe's, right? While I'm also studying.
Tell us, what's a Bembe?
A Bembe is a spiritual drum circle in the Yoruba tradition, where we invoke the Orisha, right, in the Yoruba tradition. And so I was participating in Bembes while studying Islam, and then Ausar Auset, which is an Egyptian religious society. I began to study with them. I began to go to their classes, seminars as well. I began to attend their rituals, and so forth. I had a mentor who was also a multiple religious belonger, and through him, he took us to Lakota sweat lodges, right? There was a brother who had been trained in the Lakota tradition by Lakota people. And so it was just, I guess the picture I'm trying to paint is that Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Yoruba, ancient Egyptian religious practice. I even met an Okomfo at that time who had trained in Ghana for 8 years, lived in Ghana 8 years, and trained at the shrine of Larte. And I had no idea that I would become an Okomfo, you know, some 20, 30 years, later and so forth. So, and so
I can also hear from your story how important context is, right? Like that you're in this city with all this diversity, right?
yes, yes,
So in some ways it not that everyone takes this journey who lives in Philly, but it
yeah,
facilitated it, right?
no, without a doubt, the city facilitated it. And for me, it caused me to wrestle with um, absolute and ultimate claims by each tradition, right? And so, of course, I'm seminary, theologically trained and so forth. And
Oh,
so,
wait, now how did this happen, right? So you're this dude out here learning about all these traditions, and then you decide to go to seminary.
yes,
For which tradition?
yes. I want to talk about that. But I brought it up because I realized that before I even went to seminary and I started studying pluralist theology, right? Ramondo Panakar and John Hick and other pluralist theologians and so forth. I had already developed an African American pluralist theology, basically on the streets of West Philadelphia by being surrounded by all that type of diversity. I had begun to wrestle with it. And so for me, what I came to understand is that, each of these are systems, each of these are cultural traditions, and they all are a path, right, to understanding the divine, the ultimate, right, the cosmic intelligence of the universe, however we describe it, and so forth. And so each one has a contribution to me. But ultimately, I did not accept ultimate claims, absolute claims, right? This is the only way and so forth, right? And so that has followed me my entire life. I've been shaped by that. And I've also, practiced different traditions. So when I did go to seminary, I went to a Methodist seminary and I was in the United Methodist Church. And then ultimately years later, I will become ordained.
Oh, no, let's go back, right? You were Baptist. You did all the studying and exploration. You took Shahada, and now you're United Methodist. How did bring us with you?
Okay, all right.
Believe me, I don't know this story, right? I know many of your stories, but I don't know. Like, yeah, how did you become United Methodist?
Yeah, how did I go from Yoruba Egbe in West Philly and Ausar Auset,
Right.
right? And even studying Islam to a Methodist.
Right, in a historically white Christian denomination.
Exactly. The mentor I mentioned, I had a mentor who was an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. He was in the first class, the inaugural class of the PhD program in African American Studies at Temple University. Right. So he was one of the inaugural doctoral students. Right. Not only that, he was a chaplain at Penn State University, Methodist chaplain. Then he went on to become a Methodist chaplain at Temple University. And so I met him as an undergrad. Right. He came out, he did a Black History Month program. This was in the late 80s. And again, this is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, right? He has an ankh on, right? He's sitting on the platform. He has an Egyptian ankh on, right? He has a clergy collar on, and he has a traditional kufi, right?
And you had questions.
Yeah, I'm like, whoa, like what is this? And then the way he spoke, he probably greeted in all of those traditions, right? He probably, he said Hotep. He said, Assalamu alaikum, Shalom, right? In each of those traditions, although he was an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church and a PhD student in African American Studies at Temple. I was about maybe 19, 20. He's about 10 years older. So he was like 29 years old or something at the time. This is the late 80s. And so he inspired me. His intellectualism inspired me. Without a doubt, his activism. He grew up in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. His mother was a part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Uh, uh, and of course, we know, what that movement and its fight for justice in Mississippi with Ella Baker, right, in particular. And who else I'm thinking about? Ella Baker, Sucker McClark, and it's one other name. For some reason, I can't recall right now.
I'm not placing either, but I know who you mean. Yes.
You know what I mean. Right? Forgive me. Please forgive me. And so I loved his activism, his intellectualism, and then the way he just navigated different spiritual traditions. He had grown up in Thailand as well, because his father was in the Air Force.
Yeah.
So he used to share stories about running and playing through the Buddhist temples in Thailand. Right, he was just, for me, an extraordinary person. So he had a great influence, on like for instance, he had me reading John Wesley, A Plain Account of Christian Perfection. Right, this is before I went to seminary.
Right.
He said, read this.
Undergrad reading Plain Account, right?
Yeah, right, read this, then also read the Purim Haru, the so-called ancient Egyptian book of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you finish reading that, read The Wandering Taoist, right, by Ding Ming Dao, right? He tells the stories of this early 20th century Taoist priest from China who grew up in Taoist monasteries, right? And so he's, and he's not a big deal, right? It's a matter of fact. Go read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, go read The Wandering Taoist, go read John Wesley's
and you did
of Christian Perfection, and I did. Right, and so that inspired me, and because he was a United Methodist minister and pastor, and I saw how he was navigating these different spiritual circles. Of course, it inspired me that I could do the same thing, and then I also saw okay, well. United Methodism creates spaces for the clergy to move how he's moving theologically. So maybe, in terms of, my formal theological education, I'll join the Methodist Church and do the same. Right. And so that's how I decided, to move to California, go to Claremont School of Theology, which is Methodist affiliated, and which is also historically been very open to religious pluralism and inclusivism and honoring, various spiritual traditions. So from there, I graduated from seminary. I decided I didn't want to do United Methodist. I went into African Methodism. I said, well, I think I want to be in a congregation, right, which is a predominantly Black, where I know I'm going to be, serving and teaching in Black churches and Black community. So I did that maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, just for a short time, right? I was a doctoral student, first year doctoral student, and I was like, look, I can't do this. You got it.
Well, this is when we met, right?
Yeah,
I think we met.
Yes.
I mean, time was tight, but you also had some issues, right? You wrote this manifesto.
Yeah, I wrote a manifesto to the AME Church saying they need to renounce Eurocentric white supremacist theology and ideology. They need to renounce the exclusivism of Christology as being the only way, for human salvation. They need to renounce their reliance on Protestant theology, in particular, and general Western theology in general, right? So yeah, I wrote a manifesto. They weren't they weren't pleased by that. I was like, I don't know, 30, 31 years old, right?
You're like, y'all got problems. I gotta go.
Yeah. So I exited, and again, I was still, even when I moved to the West Coast, I was still active in Ausar Auset.
Right.
There was a study group in Los Angeles. There was a temple in Oakland. The founder and leader of Ausar Auset, Raul Nefer Amen, I invited him to our seminary. Right. And so I had this Egyptian priest and chief king of the Ausar Auset Society come to our seminary. And and do a presentation and so forth. So I was still, although I was at a Methodist seminary and was in, had been in Methodist denominations, I was still deeply immersed in, Egyptian religious practice in the Ausar Auset and the communities that were in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles had their own Egyptian, ancient Egyptian or Kemetic-based study groups and spiritual societies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was still very active in that. I even did readings for a class in seminary, right?
And by readings, you mean you read from a holy text, or
like,
tell us what
I did spiritual readings,
like divination?
Divination, right? For one of our professors was teaching a course called Contemporary Usages of Ancient Egyptian Religion. And so he used the Medu Neter Volume 1, which are books that Rav Nefer Amen from Ausar Auset wrote. And so he asked me to come in and talk about my experiences in Ausar Auset. He said, we actually have a student on campus who was in the society. So I came, I spoke. They discovered that the society has an oracle or divination, divination system, divination cards. And I said, yeah, I'm familiar with it. At that time, I had been using them for like 10 years or more. They said, well, can you do readings? I said, yeah, I could do readings, but it's up to the professor. If the professor says it's okay, I'll do it. He said, fine, you could do them. So I came back and I did readings for the entire class at Claremont School of Theology.
Right, yeah, I'm just up in here doing something like also I set readings. I love it.
Yeah, right. While I was in seminary. And then 2005, I made my first trip to Ghana, West Africa, and have been traveling and connected since then, right, for 20 years now. And so my first trip to Ghana, I was initiated by an Akan priest at that time in the Mami Wata tradition. And so that was my introduction, 205, early 206. It was around.
And now, we got to pause here, right? Because you go to Ghana, presumably on just a vacation trip, right? And most people go on vacation, buy some clothes, come back home. You go on vacation and get initiated. Help us out here.
Well, the person I went with had been traveling back and forth to Ghana for 10 years by that point.
Okay.
And was very familiar with Ghana. Had family in Ghana.
So you travel like an insider.
Yeah, I travel like an insider because I went with an insider.
Okay.
And the person I went with was also very much into African traditional spirituality and culture, and was familiar with the Akan tradition. And so he's the one that introduced me to the priest who would initiate me. And so I was initiated in the Akan tradition. We started in 205, but it was January 1st, 2006, because we went during the winter season, right? Now they call that Dirty December, right? That's a whole big thing about going to Ghana in December for the holidays, right? So parties and hanging out and so forth. And I was like, okay, I used to go in December too, but I wasn't, I went to go get
religion.
I went to go get initiated, right? So January 1st, 2006 is my initiation date. That's my birthday into the Akan tradition, right? About 3 years after that, I was initiated as a priest. 2009, I was initiated as an Akan priest, which is called Okomfo. Along with another colleague and friend who was also initiated and trained, right, in the priesthood. In fact, we were trained by the same priest. So this person who took me, we went and took another friend we had in common, and then we all went and continued our initiation and training, and then were initiated as priests
You're like Akan evangelicals?
Yeah, like Akan evangelicals. And so I've been in the tradition. What's the day? Today is the 17th. Like I said, January 1st was what's that? My 19th anniversary in the Akan tradition. And so I've been studying, practicing, training, going to Akan, which is called a comb, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar to the Yoruba Bembe, for the past 19 years. When was it? 2.5 years? No, 2 years ago, I finally went over as an ordained outdoor initiated Okomfo, right? After being in tradition for like, what was that? 17 years, maybe 16 years. So that's,
when I introduced you though, you mentioned that you were an AME minister, right? So
yes.
you wrote the manifesto, you rolled out,
I left.
you left.
I came back in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was 99 when I left. I came back 11 years later. Again, this is for me. I think it's why I went to seminary. Even when I was in Ausar Auset in the early 90s in Philadelphia, not all, but some of the priests and members were like, you don't need to go to seminary. What are they going to teach you? Right? Beyond what we're offering in the society. I said, okay, fine. I understand that. I said, but for me, I understand the society you live in. I wanted to be in a position to bring these traditions into dialogue with the broader, if you will, Black mainstream spirituality and religiosity, right? I thought that these traditions were so beautiful and so powerful, and what they had done for my life, right? The broader quote unquote Black mainstream, right, which is predominantly in Black churches, in Black Protestant churches, right, that this spirituality, this knowledge, and these practices, right, need to be shared with that demographic, that congregation. And so I felt like it's irresponsible for me to be in these societies, and then of course being maybe elitist, like we have something you don't, we know something you don't, right? And so I'm like, no, I don't want to be on the sidelines like that. I want to bring these traditions in dialogue with one another, and I want to show where there is alignment and where there is symmetry, where there is congruence between the traditions, because people see them as being opposites or in conflict and so forth. So I returned, to the AME, the AME church. I was ordained in 2015 as an ordained deacon in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? So I'm a minister in the AME church. And so this is what I was doing. I was in a church where I could share some of what these spiritual communities offer, some, not all, because it did create conflict sometimes. Like,
Yeah. I was going to ask, are you here undercover? How's that, right? We know, as you said before, it's your manifesto, that much of Christianity, not all, of course, has a kind of exclusivist understanding about the path to God being through Jesus. And that's not your understanding.
No, it's not.
So how, right? But you're down for Black people. So how is this jiving, right? How is this going with your teachers? How is this going in the churches? You said, you see these commonalities, but there was sometimes conflict. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course, for me, I see the commonalities, I see the congruence, I see the alignment, the symmetry, I see it. If just look at Deuteronomy and Leviticus, my goodness, all of the rites, all of the rituals, all of the sacrifices are in indigenous spiritual systems and spiritualities of African diaspora and even other indigenous cultures, right? And so when I pick up the Old Testament, it screams at me, right? It's like it screams at me. I'm like, whoa, right? Even the New Testament. I shared something on Facebook during the holidays about I think it's the book of Luke, where there's a naming ceremony, right? But if you don't understand these traditions, where the Bible says that after Jesus was born, Mary named him on the 8th day. Anybody in the Akan tradition and other African traditions, children are named on the eighth day, and they are outdoored, and then they are taken to the traditional priest, and they make offerings of fowl. That same practice is in the New Testament in Luke, right? And so, but if you haven't been introduced to these traditions or the spirituality, you won't even see it, right? And so, for me, I think, for many of us, we're not even equipped, we're ill-equipped to even really even understand those texts and traditions independent of African history and African spirituality. And I know that's a bold, statement for many people, but it's true, right? It's true. But making that clear to other folk, right? Sometimes it's welcome and appreciated. And other times, there's conflict and people become upset or, don't want to hear that. And so I've experienced both, right? I've been asked to be quiet, sit down, right? But then I've been asked, okay, but share this much, right?
Mm-hmm.
We understand you, but the people aren't always ready, Brother Salim, Dr. Faraji. So share this much, right? Share this much. And so I've been told that by my pastoral colleagues in private, many of whom, not all, many of whom are aware of these traditions and read and study them, but they never share it from their pulpits. Or I've been told, look, you can't talk about this from the pulpit, but you can do it in a Bible study or a church history seminar, right? But the pulpit is folk not ready, right? So I've heard all, all of these things. And so this is what I've tried to do in my capacity as as an AU minister, and someone who's an Okomfo and an Egyptian priest. It's about being in the community, being with the people, and being connected. Because the demographic reality is nearly 75%, definitely 2/3 of Black America is Protestant. That's a demographic fact. And even for those who are not, right, their primary reference point for religion and even religious history is the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so for me, I have to be conversant in that tradition. I have to be a multi-religious conversationist, if you will, right? Conversant in these traditions, to bring them into dialogue, right? To educate, and not only that, also to participate in healing, because we know through the legacies of slavery, the legacies of Jim Crow, the legacies of theological brainwashing, religious brainwashing, that is a point of trauma, right? Not only here in the United States, but even around the African diaspora as well. And so that's what it is for me, right? And so, I've been holding these three, traditions together. Now, for me,
so many questions.
Where my heart is, like, what inspires me, like me for my own spiritual development and nutrition, so to speak, right?
That's what I was going to ask you.
What inspires me, like, hands down, it's the Nile Valley. It's the Nile Valley.
Of course.
Ancient Egypt, ancient Nubia, or ancient Kush, ancient Canaan.
And now you didn't mention amongst your books, right? The book you have about Kemetic martial arts.
Yes.
Right. Is that Montu Scholar? Is that the
Montu Scholar? Yeah, I started training in the martial arts in 99, 2000. I met a teacher here in Los Angeles, and he had a school called the Montu Academy for African martial arts. So I began to train with him, and we integrated ancient Egyptian history, culture, and spirituality into these martial systems, because the oldest combat systems on the planet, of course, originated on the African continent. Right, the first humans to hunt, right? The first humans to have to defend themselves against other humans, as well as animals, creatures, whatever.
If
right?
you're a hunter, you have to be a warrior.
You gotta be a warrior. And so, and then, of course, in ancient Egypt, there's images of them engaged in stick fighting, grappling, wrestling, empty hand combat, right? Preserved. One of the most famous is the tomb of Beni Hassan during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, during the Pharaoh of Amenhotep, Pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom, and so forth. So, yes, that's what inspires me. Now, what tradition anchors me ancestrally,
Mm-hmm.
and even ecologically, and even communally? That's
Mm-hmm.
the Akan tradition for me. The ancestral connection, the understanding of nature and the cosmos, for me, is beautiful in the Akan tradition, and in other African cultural traditions as well. Right. And so, ancient Kemet or Kush, it gives me the cosmic inspiration. Right. It's like this, like the human potentiality of the human, because we're eternal, we're immortal. Right. But we're also two beings, right? We're half species, half divine, if you will, right? And so that tradition, the cosmic inspiration, the Akan tradition is eco-spirituality, the ancestral connection, and the ritual, right? And the strong emphasis on family, strong emphasis on community, right? In that tradition.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Diverse Devotions, Black Belief Across Boundaries. I hope today's conversation has sparked something in you, whether it's a question, a new insight, or simply a deeper understanding of the many ways Black folk engage with spirituality and religion. Remember to check out the show notes for more resources. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow, rate, and share to help others discover the power of diverse religious experiences. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment or send us a message about your thoughts and experiences at diversedevotions.com. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep breaking the rules of how faith is supposed to work.